Hello summoners and welcome to another Pro Guides video. I'm Crumbs and I'm here with our 12.8 low elo tier list. Our regular tier list, which we post with the patch rundown and mid-patch updates, is aimed at around the high gold to platinum skill level. But we kept moving champs like Jace and Akali up on the list since, when played perfectly, those champs are pretty broken. But the thing is, people in the gold to plat level don't play perfectly. That's why we recently made a high elo tier list to differentiate what's subjectively the best when played to perfection versus a realistic performance in the middle elos. And that got us thinking, why not also make a tier list for the lower levels of play too? I know it's tempting to try and lock in what the pros and high elo streamers play, but trust me, the best thing to do for climbing is acknowledging that sometimes some champs are a bit too hard to pull off until you're better at the game. And conversely, some champs are way better at lower levels because your enemies aren't as coordinated or don't have the game knowledge and mechanics needed to counter them. So, with all that said, let's get into this tier list, shall we? First, we'll start off with our top laners. Lilia gets bumped all the way to the OP tier. The buff she got to her healing on 12.7 is treating her well, with her now being able to easily deal with opponents of all classes instead of being relegated to just a counter pick to tanks. Now, she's not just a safe blind pick, she's a pretty OP one that you can use to dominate most opponents. Just be sure to remember that even when you win a matchup really hard, you don't just run at your opponents and try to whack them to death. Even when you're ahead, you want to kite them around with the movement speed from your Q's passive and win the slow and steady sustain war. Yorick also gets promoted up to the OP tier. Split pushing is always a good strat in solo queue. The lack of coordination and clashing egos on the enemy team can let you take a lead and run away with it. And at the lower levels of play, you're really playing to that lack of coordination bit. It's all too common that you'll be allowed to split push all the way down the lane, taking the second and even third turret before the enemy team actually sends help. And by then, it's very likely too little, too late. With his passive getting buffed this patch, we're moving Mord up to the S tier. With his insane damage and durability, sticking power is the only real weakness Mord has. His passive is supposed to help provide some, but 3% movement speed doesn't really do all that much. So, with that being tripled at level 11, Mord should have a much better time sticking to targets, especially in his ult, where it's crucial to kill them before the timer expires. While there's probably a bit of a learning curve for people picking up Wukong, he still performed worse than we thought he would after all those big buffs. So, we're moving him down to the A tier for now. Maybe he'll move up a bit as people learn to use him the right way. Sett is getting put into the A tier as well. He performs a bit better at the lower ranks than he does at higher levels, mostly because there's a lot more fighting to the death tier, which he excels at. There's even a strong argument to put him in the S tier, but for now, we'll just keep him here. Rengar gets demoted all the way to the C tier. Basically, there's just no reason you want to pick this champ in the top lane. He's the type of champ that you pretty much need flawless mechanics for, and the point of this tier list is to find the easier to pull off champions. So for now, find something a bit simpler and work on core concepts first. Karma also moves down to the C tier. In lower elo, it's generally the champs that can carry for themselves that do better, so it makes sense that someone like Karma wouldn't really do so great down here. She can bully lane pretty well early on, but that's about it. She quickly falls off and reaches the point that most side laners will just roll you. Now for the jungle, here's our list. With how insanely well Shyvana's been doing with the new AP Bruiser build, we have no choice but to bump her up to the OP tier. Gone are the days where Shyvana was the worst pick in the game. Now she's one of the very best, with the ability to absolutely roll fights in the mid game while being almost impossible to bring down. Mordekaiser's getting bumped up a tier in this role too, landing himself in the S tier. Just like with top, he has plenty of damage and survivability, but he can't do much with elite against super kitey teams. But with the movement speed buff, you'll be able to translate those leads into easier team fighting and hopefully be able to actually bring down the carries you target. Lilia is being raised up to the A tier. While she does have a different playstyle than most junglers, she's mechanically super easy to play. You just have to get used to kiting in and out of fights as you land your Qs, never fully committing until your opponents are low enough. Another big selling point for Lilia is that she's one of the few carry junglers that also has a huge form of engage via her ult. That said, it's really only available when her flash is up, since you're rarely going to get her poison on 3+ people at the same time without it. Skarner gets moved down to the B tier. He's one of our favorite champs to vouch for on this channel, but he's just been a bit too lacking lately. Usually his slow but steady farm then pick playstyle works super well, but he just isn't cutting it in the current meta. The only times I'd say you may want to pick him is if the enemy jungler is another slow paced champ and your team has a champ that can enable you, like Lulu or Zilean. Xin Zhao gets demoted to the C tier. Xin just isn't doing great at any level of play, but he's especially suffering in lower skill brackets right now. He's a champ that requires a super high tempo early game to do well, and generally, that's a skill you only see at the higher levels. Aside from that, games in the lower elo get dragged out quite a bit, so champs that need to do well early and close the game out fast tend to do quite a bit worse. Gragas is getting demoted to the D tier. There just really aren't much worse choices than this in the jungle. He can't really duel other junglers, his ganks are super lackluster, and his scaling is just kinda meh. He just doesn't do a good job as either a tank or a carry, and if you try to go bruiser, he's somehow even more useless. Lastly for the jungle, we have Olaf being demoted to the D tier. As I said with Xin, Olaf suffers immensely from being a champ that relies on snowballing early and closing out the game fast. But even when he does have a lead, he's really just not that good right now. He shares a lot of his design issues with Hecarim. If he's ahead and you build tank, he just doesn't do damage. But if you build damage, he gets completely melted before he can reach the backline. Now, here's our mid lane tier list. Yasuo gets promoted to the OP tier. Even though his last round of buffs seemed pretty trivial, Yasuo has been doing a lot better lately. Being decent early and really strong later on, Yasuo is definitely a really reliable champion for carrying in lower elo. Just be sure not to fall into the stereotypical Yasuo player mindset and tilt the second you get ganked. If you can play this champ with a good mental, you'll be carrying the majority of your games. Malzahar is being promoted to the S tier. He's just way too consistent of a champ to be any lower. He has good wave clear, super high damage in extended team fights, and a flash ult that can make a game-winning catch if your opponents don't pay the QSS tax. Be sure to think about your build. So many people are just defaulting to the same one every game, buying Lucidity boots and Rylai's after Liandry's. But if your team has enough utility, buy Sorks and Shadow Flame for a huge boost to your damage output. Kennen is also getting moved to the S tier. He's another champ that just does especially well in the lower ranks because most games get dragged out of lane, and he's a champ that excels in teamfights. Once you get past 3 items, just find a good flank and flash ult to one-shot half the enemy team. Another champ that we think belongs in the S tier is Yone. He's being outperformed by his brother just a bit, but being such a hard scaling melee hyper carry, he's still an insanely strong pick, easily having the damage to slice through entire teams once you have 2 or 3 items. Ahri gets bumped down to the A tier. While she's still doing super well in the higher elos, she just doesn't do so well in the lower levels. While it's hard to pinpoint exactly why that is, part of it may be because lower elo players tend to lack the proactivity you need to have when you're playing her. It's common to see Ahri players just plant themselves in mid lane and use their ult as a defensive tool at lower levels of play, while higher elo ones will constantly look to roam when their ulti is off cooldown. Wukong gets dropped to the B tier. He's a super strong counter to melee mid laners, especially the AD ones, but due to how badly he gets poked out and outshoved by mages, we have to consider him a situational pick. Vex, on the other hand, lands in the B tier because she's just meh all around. She doesn't have any awful matchups, but she doesn't have very many great ones either. Now let's move things down to the bottom lane. Yasuo gets promoted to the OP tier in bot lane as well. Not only is he just objectively a pretty strong bot laner, but lower elo players in particular kind of panic once he reaches the point when he can start going in for more aggressive trades. You can just keep diving in on the way with E and going for quick bursty trades until your enemy laners are low enough for you to commit to an all-in. Heimerdinger drops down to the S tier. This is the first time in months that I've been able to say that. He's definitely still a very strong champion, and arguably the very best if you just want to win lane hard, but the other champs in the category carry a lot harder when it comes time to teamfight. As if the lifesteal nerfs weren't enough, now Jinx is getting a direct nerf, so she's dropping down to the A tier. She's still a very strong hyper carry, being arguably the best in the game once she has 3 items, but being squishier makes that something that she can less consistently obtain. Tristana is being bumped up to the A tier. When it comes to self-sufficient marksman, she's number 1. She has resetting mobility, super high range early on, and her ult even gives her some self-peel. Remember, you don't always have to jump in with Tristana. It's okay to use her W to reposition in teamfights to find a new angle to pelt the enemy team with your autos. To finish things off, we have our supports. Despite Bard being buffed this patch, we're actually moving him down to the C tier. He's a pretty strong champ, but you need to have some pretty big playmaking capabilities to pull him off, and you need a team that's coordinated enough to follow up on the plays you're making. Even if you're able to set up huge plays, it's a pretty feels bad moment when the rest of your team isn't even aware enough to realize it. Braum also drops down to the C tier. He's usually considered a situational pick, but honestly, even in the best situations to pick him, there's almost always a better option. Other tanks offer better peel and engage, while enchanters are just the best overall due to them having a huge impact even with little effort. Gragas drops down to the D tier. When you pull off a Gragas Flash ER combo, it can be really satisfying, but that's something you can only do post 6, and only once every 5 minutes or so. Being useful every 5 minutes isn't exactly enough to be a good pick, or even a viable one. Especially after making the AD carry pretty much 1v2 the lane, setting them behind right from the start of the match. Lastly, we have Thresh, who is also moving down to the D tier. It's hard to believe that the most popular support of all time, who was also one of the most dominant for a pretty good chunk of last season and has always been in and out of the meta in the years before, is this low. But due to how OP he is in pro play, it wasn't enough to just nerf Thresh once. Riot had to nerf him again and again until we ended up where we are now, where he's not even remotely viable. And that about wraps things up for our 12.8 low elo tier list. I hope you enjoyed the video. Since making this list involved going over all the champs and all the roles, I'm sure we overlooked a pick here or there. So feel free to let us know if you think we missed something down in the comments below. Don't forget to check out our Discord in the description box below, where you can discuss League further or just hang out and be a part of our community. I can't wait to see you guys back for the next video. But until then, good luck on the Rift, and may the LP gods smile down upon you.